Hello and welcome. This is video number 1 in an 8-part series about the Industrial Revolution. So throughout this series, we'll take a look at the basics, the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, the ways that impacted people's lives, and we'll also take a look at the economic systems of capitalism and socialism. They are examples of economic systems that, in the case of capitalism, had continued to develop, and then in the case of socialism, an economic perspective that began to emerge largely through some of the really challenging circumstances with early industrialization. So by the time we get done with the series, we'll have talked about a lot of different aspects of industrialization. In today's video, we're going to focus on, first of all, defining what the Industrial Revolution means, and then talking about the agricultural revolution that really gave it the opportunity to happen. So with that, we'll get started. All right, so as far as speaking to what the Industrial Revolution even means, basically what it represents is the time when there was a shift from it always being human power or maybe the use of animal power to do things, to produce things, to beginning to use machines. And as far as the time and place where this shift really begins to happen first, we see this happen in England in the mid-1700s. And then from there, it will end up fanning out to various parts of the world. And then one of the things that's kind of interesting about industrialization is even though in places like England, it began to develop over a couple hundred years ago, and in places like the United States and much of the European countries, industrialization would quickly take shape in those countries. There are still parts of the world today that are not industrialized, and there are parts of the world that are in the process of industrializing. And wherever a country finds itself today, at least relative to industrialization, doesn't necessarily make it a better country or a worse country. But it's just kind of interesting that so much of what we've talked about so far with world history are things that are clearly in the past. But as we get to topics like the Industrial Revolution, to a certain degree, for some places, that's either a part of their present or might be something in their future. So kind of an interesting topic. But with the rest of the time in today's video, we're going to look at something called the Agricultural Revolution, because before industrialization was really able to develop, one of the things that needed to happen is people needed to get better and more efficient at meeting their basic needs, like having enough food to eat. And because one of the things we see with industrialization is it was really only when people became very proficient at meeting their basic needs did they have really the time and the energy to be able to think about the things they did day in and day out and begin finding steps to do those things much easier than had been true before. So as we talk about the agricultural revolution, one thing I want to speak to before we get into just a few details of things that were changing with agriculture is that for an agricultural revolution to happen, for people to get much improved at producing the food they needed for survival, one thing that did have to exist was a desire to improve. The agricultural revolution didn't happen just by random chance, and that, over a short period of time, people all of a sudden got much better at producing food. They had a desire to figure out better ways to do things. And I think if you think about just about anything that you might be involved with, you're generally not going to improve much or change much from where you are right now if you don't have a desire to improve or a desire to change. Because if you looked at agricultural activities prior to the 1700s, it really wouldn't have mattered really what time you jumped in at. Things would have probably looked pretty similar. So if you would have looked at agriculture in 1500, the year 1000, the year 500 BC, you probably wouldn't have seen a whole lot of changes. But out of a desire to produce more food, a strong and maybe somewhat of a new desire to produce more food, we see innovations take place that in some cases dramatically increase food production. So just going through a few examples, and these will really be catered towards England pretty specifically. One thing had to do with land use and just the efficiency with which the land was used. Prior to the agricultural revolution, what was true in England is there were many, many very small farms. They were not necessarily fenced in or anything like that. It might even be hard to tell when you went from one farm to another. but they were very small farming operations scattered all over the place. Now, from an efficiency standpoint, that's not necessarily going to be the most efficient use of the land. And so one of the changes that happens is something that overall is called the Enclosure Movement, which began to develop when wealthy landowners began to buy up smaller farms and consolidate those smaller plots of land into bigger defined plots of land. One of the things that you begin seeing as these small farms get bought up are fences put up to enclose the land to better define one large farming operation from another. And one of the things that would come from this would be things like being able to have dedicated spaces for growing crops and dedicated spaces for holding the livestock. Prior to this enclosure movement, where crops were grown and where livestock roamed were one and the same. As I'm sure you can imagine, if you have livestock walking around where you're trying to grow crops, that's going to do some damage, and you're not going to grow as much food as you otherwise might. And another big thing that came from this movement is with small farms being bought up, that meant people who had been involved with farming at a very small scale level now left for cities to find something else to do. And that'll become an important aspect of the labor supply that becomes a part of the Industrial Revolution. Now, another thing that really began to develop at this time was people getting a lot more scientific about their farming. In the past, there were observations certainly made about things that seemed to work better or things that seemed to work worse, but there was not necessarily a lot of energy put into constantly and steadily trying to improve. It was more of just kind of go with it, and when things worked out, keep doing what you're doing. But during the 1700s, you begin to see, especially in England, you begin to see people really try to think about cause and effect and experiment with different ways of doing things, which we shouldn't be surprised. Getting into the 1700s, the scientific revolution was well underway. So the idea of taking an objective, thoughtful approach to everything was really becoming a part of many societies, especially places like England. And so I just wanted to mention one example. On the screen there, you can see what's called the seed drill. This was something that was invented by Jethro Tull. And basically what the seed drill was a way to plant seed into the ground in a consistent way. The method that was normal prior to devices like the seed drill was just to throw seed on top of the ground and hope for the best. And of course, as you can imagine, between wind and rain and birds, for example, a lot of that seed wouldn't ever grow into anything. So it was a pretty inefficient use of seed. But with the seed drill, they were able to plant seed into the ground at a consistent depth. And what they found, not surprisingly, is a lot more of that seed took root and grew into whatever it was that they were trying to grow. So just being more thoughtful and more scientific in their approach to planting, for example, was a big step towards producing more food. Also in the same vein of being thoughtful about growing crops and producing more food was what they came to understand about nutrients in the soil. One of the things that they did know from practice from earlier centuries is that if you grew the same thing in the same field season after season, you'd use up the nutrients and then the soil wouldn't be very good for growing. And so what they had done before was kind of a rotation system where they grew crops some of the time, and then some of the time they didn't grow crops, and they would let the field lie fallow. That's fine. That's a way to help maintain nutrition in the soil. Problem is, it's a pretty inefficient use of your land if you end up allowing up to half of it to just sit there effectively doing nothing for a season. And so what they got into was a crop rotation system. They came to understand that depending on what it was that you were growing, some crops restored nutrients into the soil, some crops took nutrients out. But if you could rotate them in the proper order, you could use more of your fields and make sure that nutrition was being able to be maintained in the soil. So through crop rotation, they were able to use more fields more of the time. Again, more efficient use of time and resources, more food grown, good progress. Now, one other thing to point to where they made some innovations was with livestock breeding. In the past, when they raised livestock, they just kind of had what they had, and the livestock produced what it produced, and they got what they got. But again, now is a time when people were being more scientific. And so one of the things they recognized is, for example, if bigger animals like with lamb bred with each other, they tended to produce bigger offspring. So they simply got more intentional about the breeding of the livestock that they had, and they were able to increase output. And the example with lamb was in the year 1700, about the average size of a lamb was 18 pounds. And through intentional breeding, by 1786, so not even a century later, the average size was up to 50 pounds. So that's quite an increase. Now, what all of this ultimately did is led to a pretty dramatic population increase in England, and places that engaged in an agricultural revolution saw the same thing. If you look at the graph up here, you can see that the population of England was relatively flat and very slow growing for centuries. And then by the time you get to the 1700s and into the 1800s, when all of these innovations come around, population skyrockets. And this would definitely play into industrialization, because as the population increased, the demand for all the different kinds of things you needed in society went up pretty sharply. And with growing demand for basically everything, there was a real incentive to become more efficient at producing all of the things that they would normally need day in and day out. And it's out of this demand that comes innovation that will be essentially what we know of as the Industrial Revolution. So that's where we're going to leave it with this video. As we come into the next video, we'll talk about the reasons why England was a leader for industrialization and why it really happened there first. I hope you'll join me with that video. Hopefully you found this informative and helpful. Thanks for watching.